Yo, what is going on, guys? Welcome back to another video. So if you're watching this, the Toronto Maple Leafs have been eliminated. Yes, this is pre-recorded. I'm dropping it literally within the minute that Toronto loses, whenever that is. I feel like one of those guys that's like in the movies that dies and then like at their will reading, he's like, if you're seeing this, I died. Well, if you're seeing this, the Toronto Maple Leafs have lost and they have a pretty important offseason coming up. And the number one guy that has been scapegoated and the one guy that they potentially could trade is obviously Mitch Marner. He had a very disappointing playoffs. People are calling him too small, too soft, doesn't produce, and he only has 1 year left on his contract, which, although he does have a no movement clause, you guys are probably screaming that at the screen right now. I do think there is a way that you can get him to waive it. First off, maybe he just wants a new fresh start, even though he is a Toronto-based kid. He's let the franchise down so much. Maybe he wants a fresh start, wants to get rid of all these pressure and expectations, go to a lesser hockey market that's not going to do that. And also, I think one of the main things is when looking at Mitch Marner and his potential future earnings is if you're Brad Treliving, you tell Mitch Marner, we're not going to re-sign you. So if you want to go get that 8th year somewhere else, that coveted 8th year of a long-term extension, which you can only do if that player's on your team, you can't get that in an open market, unrestricted free agency. If you want that 8th year, you're going to waive that goddamn clause because we are not going to re-sign him. You are not a part of our long-term future. So I asked you guys actually on Saturday night when they were down to the Boston Bruins and Marner was playing pretty horrendous. I asked you guys to send me some Marner hypothetical trades. So we are going to go through 13 trades right now. I'm going to break it down. I think this is a realistic deal. All these are like realistic value in terms of Marner. There's some circumstances that maybe I don't think it's that good of a deal. Maybe I think it's great. So let's dive into it because Marner, if someone's going to get traded, it appears to be him. And up first, we have probably the team that got the most submissions, and that is Utah making a splash for Marner. I ended up going with Marner for Keller, Lawson, Krause. It's actually spelled with the C and an O instead of the U. In a third, this comes to us from Oliver. Thank you, Oliver. Keller, Krause, in a third. I think on its face, in terms of player value, it makes a lot of sense. Keller is basically Mitch Marner, but like without the defense, if that makes sense. Both very good playmakers, but Mitch Marner's like Selke level defense. Clayton Keller doesn't really play a lot of defense. Lawson Krause is a very solid, like second, third, middle sixer for the most part. 23 goals, 18 assists at a reasonable $4.1 million. But what really makes this a deal that I probably wouldn't do for Utah is Mitch Marner is obviously owed $10.9 million next season, then is probably going to get a pay bump on his next contract versus Clayton Keller is only getting paid $7.1 million over the next 4 years. So that is one of the best contracts in the entire NHL. I understand the logic. It wouldn't be the worst trade ever. Ryan Smith goes out and tries to get a legit superstar, and the Utah fans don't really have a connection with Clayton Keller. I'm sure Arizona Coyotes fans, if follow the team, would be absolutely gutted. But I think the value does make sense. But once you factor in the fact that Krause is on a very good contract and Keller is on a great contract, I'm not sure I love that 1,000%, but player value, I really like it a lot. Next up, Carolina Hurricanes, Martin Necas, a first-round pick, and Orlov. When looking at this, I don't know how they would basically have to kiss Jake Gensel goodbye if they did this kind of trade. I understand where from a player value standpoint, if you're Toronto, you bring in a pretty solid offensive defenseman in Dmitry Orlov, a young winger to replace Mitch Marner, as well as get a first-round pick. The only problem is Necas, you're going to take on probably more money in that scenario than you would have with Mitch Marner, considering Necas is going to want $6 to $7 million, the bare minimum. Orlov's making 7.7. I think the Carolina Hurricanes would have to retain on a Dmitry Orlov, considering he's making 7.75. Not really worth that. Not sure I absolutely love that deal. Next up, Steven loves hockey. Brat, a 2025 first, and Nathan Bastian. Again, similarly to the Utah trade, I like the value in this. I'm not going to sit here and be like, Brat's better than Mitch Marner. Mitch Marner is the better player in this scenario. But when looking at the contracts again, I think that this does make sense. Say next year, if the Devils didn't make the playoffs or missed and lost, or made it and lost in the first round, then maybe you switch up the Devils core. But I'm not sure they do that quite yet. And when looking at Bratt, he did just sign an 8-year, $7.8 or $7.9 million contract. It's going to look very good versus Mitch Marner. But I think that makes a lot of sense. If New Jersey wants to really level up and get more of a two-way guy in Mitch Marner, it's a solid trade. I don't love them giving up a first-round pick on top of that, but that's probably the price that you need to pay in order to upgrade from Bratt to Mitch Marner. Next up, Pietrangelo in a second for Mitch Marner. This comes to us from Broth. I've seen this a lot. I think Jay Fresh did like a poll on this, whether I think this would be a good deal. It's risky, but I do think that this would be a pretty solid deal for Toronto in the short term. They'd obviously be selling themselves out down the river in terms of future, considering Pietrangelo is, 34 years old. But I think Pietrangelo would be that two-way physical defenseman that they needed. Their defense core is horrendous this year. He'd immediately be the number one over Morgan Riley. I don't think that's controversial. So I think in terms of team fit, Toronto might be better with Alex Pietrangelo next year, but the age is so different between these two. If I'm Vegas, I'm easily signing up for this. I got Shea Theodore and Noah Hannafin as my top two guys for the next. Oh, Theodore needs an extension, but most likely for the next 6 to 7 years. I would do this if I was Vegas. Toronto, if I can maybe get like a first round pick. I don't even know if they have a first round pick. They have their 2024 first round pick, but they're not going to give that up because they're hosting the draft. But if I can get maybe a young either defenseman, a young forward in this scenario, maybe I pull the trigger. But that's a very interesting, and I've seen that a lot. Very solid. Nashville. This comes to us from my boy 17 Mellow Cats. What's up, Gabe? When looking at it, Saros for Marner, 1-for-1. I'm not sure exactly how the money would work on this. I think Nashville does have some money, so they would be able to take on Mitch Marner. But if you're Toronto, would you rather have UC Saros at what? $5 million next season, or Mitch Marner at 10.6, have another 5.9 in order to spend? I think you would definitely look at that. Joseph Woll is the long-term answer. They're going to get rid of Samsonov. I think that goes without saying with how poor and inconsistent he looked this year. So is bringing in Saros, is trading away an elite winger for Saros, is that going to help you out when your offense has kind of been letting you down recently in the past two playoff runs? It's definitely interesting. Goaltending is going to be a position of concern. If they can get Saros, and they're not going to give up Evangelista, but if they can get another young forward out of Nashville, then I'd probably do it. But a very solid deal overall. Next up, Minnesota. Fever and Nets gives us Boldy, Brodin, and Marner. This is very solid. Again, in terms of next year player value, I really like this deal. Brodin is a very good, still top pair defenseman. Matthew Boldy is going to give you around 35 and 35. But going forward, if I'm Minnesota, I'm not sure I'm doing this, considering Matthew Boldy is entering the second year of a $7-year $1 million per contract. That is going to be one of the best deals in the entire NHL, considering he's only 22 or 23 years old. Even if it was Boldy for Marner, I could see an argument for not accepting that. That might be crazy. I'm just very high on Matthew Boldy. I think Matthew Boldy's probably going to be better than Mitch Marner in 3 to 4 years. When Boldy, a 26-year-old or 27-year-old Boldy versus a 30 to 31-year-old Mitch Marner, I'm probably going Matthew Boldy. I'm very high on Matthew Boldy. If you make it Boldy, I don't even know who else is in their defense core, but Boldy and another defenseman, not Spurgeon or Faber, or Boldy and another solid forward, I could see that. Boldy and Brodin, I don't really love, considering the cap situation in Minnesota the next couple of years. Taking on a guy like Marner, paying that extension will be tough, but definitely a good framework for a potential deal. First New York Islanders deal. Sign and trade for Sorokin. Similar thing to Saros. The only problem is Sorokin was kind of bad this year, if we're going to be honest, by New York Islanders, and he's entering an $8.25 million contract. I think the Islanders would probably have to give up more on top of Sorokin in order to get this deal done. I would look into it, considering Varley has looked so good. I think he does have another 2 to 3 years maybe of being a good starter, and we can sign someone else, maybe get out of a potential Barrett Sorokin deal for a guy like Mitch Marner, the skill that we have maybe been lacking, or we got some skill, but we definitely need more to potentially go on a deep playoff run. I kind of like that deal, the framework of that deal. Another interesting deal, Marner for Dobson, and I think on face value, when you don't consider the rest of the team, especially the New York Islanders, I think this deal is very solid value. The Toronto Maple Leafs get an actual future number one defenseman, two-way guy, mainly offensive guy, to boost their offensive output from their defense core. I think this would be very good for them. Dobson's only making $4 million next year. Islanders get Marner, elite offensive talent. The only problem is that Islanders defense core, if they traded away Dobson, it wouldn't be that good. It would be okay, but from an offensive standpoint, if Romanov, Pelech, Polak is your top three defensemen, from an offensive defenseman standpoint, that would be pretty brutal. The Islanders are not trading Noah Dobson. They are not trading Noah Dobson. Although I think if the Islanders had a more beefy defense core, especially offensively, that would be something that I think would be considered, and I think would be really interesting for a potential deal. Next up, Ottawa. Chychrun, Pinto in a second. And I think that this is a very, very solid deal, but it's not going to happen. If Ottawa was in Florida or not even Florida. That's still Atlantic Division. If Florida, if Ottawa had the same roster, if Ottawa's roster was say the LA Kings, I think this deal makes a lot of sense. A legit top pairing two-way defenseman in Jacob Chikrin, as well as a young forward with promise that's obviously not close to a Mitch Marner yet. I think that this deal would make a lot of sense. I think this is a good deal probably for both teams, arguably, although Ottawa probably wants to bring in as well as a solid top pair defenseman this summer, especially defensively. But I think that this, in a potential Chikrin trade, but I think this deal value-wise does make a lot of sense. It's just never going to happen. There's never going to be this much of a blockbuster between Ottawa and Toronto. You can see a Matt Murray kind of trade when Ottawa's not really winning quite yet. Those deals can kind of go through, but this level of a blockbuster, I can't see both teams doing this. Moving on, we got a Wyatt Johnston who is absolutely tearing up the playoffs right now. A second and a third. If I'm Dallas, I am not sure I'm doing this. Wyatt Johnston just had 32 goals, 33 assists for 65 points at 20 years old. I definitely think Marner is the better player right now, going to be the better player for 2 to 3 years. But when looking at it next year, Wyatt Johnston gives him a better chance to win than Mitch Marner. Still in a last year of an ELC than Mitch Marner at $10.9 million. I understand this. If Dallas had the money, if they end up losing this year to Vegas, maybe you try to panic and try to get another star, but I think their forward core is, for the most part, the least of their concerns. Yes, they're going to have to deal with Pavelski getting up there in age. Matt Duchene might walk, but if I'm Dallas, I'm more so focusing on maybe a future second pair defenseman, assuming you're not going to sign Chris Tanev, or Chris Tanev's only going to get worse from here on. I'm not sure making a massive splash and getting Mitch Marner is the solution of your problems, especially considering Wyatt Johnston's playing better than Mitch Marner right now. Next up, Garland, Hronek, 2025 first. I think you might be able to take away that 2025 first, make it a second. When looking at it, I guess it makes some sense. The money about adds up. What, Garland gets like $5 million. Hronek on his extension is going to get $7 to $8 million. So Vancouver might be even saving some money. But if you're Vancouver, I think you got to value your depth a little bit more. I understand this deal, but Vancouver does have the star power. This isn't like the Seattle Kraken that maybe should go out and see if there's a market for Mitch Marner to get that star player. If I'm Vancouver, I'm probably re-signing Hronek. You've been dreaming of having that number 2 defenseman for Quinn Hughes. From a Maple Leaf standpoint, yeah, I probably would do this. I think Hronek is probably better than Morgan Riley, not Mitch Marner, as well as adding a guy like Garland into your second line, maybe even your first line. I think this would be a very good deal for the Toronto Maple Leafs. Don't really see it too much for the Vancouver Canucks. Over to Anaheim, Marner for McTavish. I see the vision on this. I think McTavish is going to be a star player. Toronto goes cheaper while Anaheim gets their star, or their established star at least. They have some young stars that are going to be eventual stars. I don't think Anaheim's quite ready yet. Maybe in a year or two. I still don't think that they trade Mason McTavish. If they got like Macklin Celebrini, if they got a top 2, the first overall pick, or maybe even the second or third, maybe McTavish becomes expendable to some degree, but not quite. They're not going to be going heavy all in until 2026, 2027. Don't rush the rebuild. Chill. Don't be trading for Mitch Marner. And there's another Anaheim deal on this. Gibson and Zegras. This one's a no-go for me. John Gibson is way too inconsistent. Still making, $6 million the next 3 to 4 years. I'd stay away from John Gibson. Sorokin and Saros. Saros, definitely. Even Sorokin, I'd bet on. John Gibson, not so much the case. Montreal, Marner, Gooley, Matheson, a first and a second. Not sure that maybe they would give up a second. I'm not sure about a first on top of it. It makes sense. The Leafs defense score has been so bad. It wouldn't happen, obviously, but if you get all those that first, second, good young defenseman, and then Mike Matheson who has 62 points out of nowhere, I think that's solid value if Toronto wanted to revamp their defense core and also shed a lot of money. For Montreal, I guess it makes sense. I like their young forward core. I think when looking at it, I guess Gooley is a little bit expendable now that they do have a lot of young defensemen up and coming. It's an interesting deal. It's an interesting deal, but similarly to the Ottawa one, it's just not happening. There's not going to be a Montreal-Toronto, especially to that degree with the Mitch Marner. And then lastly, we got a pretty interesting one. It's a New York Rangers one, and this is only in a certain scenario, but let me explain. Breadman and Kakko along I might have to blur that out. With a 5th round pick for Blank Boy and Robertson. When looking at this, I think the only scenario that this could happen is if the New York Rangers lose in 4 or 5 games, or just lose in general and Panarin is a ghost. Then maybe you would consider trading Panarin. And I do think technically Marner probably does have more value than Panarin just because he's 6 or 7 years younger. So I could understand this for both sides if the Leafs lose in 5 games and the Rangers lose pretty convincingly against Carolina. I'm not saying this could happen. Not saying that's going to happen. I'm not a hater. I'm not here to be a hater. I think they're definitely going to, I don't think they're going to win, but I think they're going to put up a fight, and I think Panarin's going to play well. But if you're looking at both teams and they have underwhelming performances relative to expectations, and Panarin and Marner don't play that good, maybe a swap of some sorts can happen. And I do think Marner does have more value. Capo Caco, I think, has more value than Nick Robertson. So that's a pretty interesting trade. I think both sides would at least entertain it, given the circumstances that I laid out. Obviously, if the Rangers make the Eastern Conference Finals, Stanley Cup Finals, win the Stanley Cup, and Panarin plays great, he ain't getting traded unless it's for a legitimate top 10 player in the entire NHL, which Mitch Marner isn't right now. But if they kind of have disastrous ends, maybe they try to change things up and do something like that. But let me know in the comments, what do you think about these trades? Do you think Mitch Marner is going to end up getting traded? And I'll be seeing you in the next one.